Adrenaline thing, go for landing, 3,000 feet. You're looking great.
This is the podcast where inspiring leaders share their stories to empower you, unlock your potential, and create a winning mindset for your future. My name is Luke Murfitt, the UK Entrepreneur of the Year, and my co-host is thought leader Kim Adele. Welcome to Global Futurists. Good morning and welcome to Global Futurists. My name is Luke Murfitt and we have another fantastic podcast for you. We're on YouTube, we're on CMX, cxm.co.uk live, and we are so grateful that you're here. Today we have a fantastic international award-winning author with the latest book, Boss Branding, and the name is Sudhana Singh. Good morning, Sudhana.
Good morning, Luke.
How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. Lovely sunny day out there. Fantastic.
Yeah, it's really awesome to come together and be able to obviously, you're already a celebrated author with various books, and this is quite a time, I think, quite poignant, isn't it, to be able to come together and talk to you about your life up to now and about where what brought you to this point, and also the wonderful book that we know is Boss Branding. So good. Thank you for coming to us. So the how are things going for you anyway, in terms of obviously as a it must be quite the fast lane at the moment with obviously your latest book coming to number one. How did your memoir Kindness, Kettlebells position brand?
My memoir was actually my first book that I had written. And I was in that very unfortunate position at the time where I was a head teacher and I sued my employers at that time for race discrimination, harassment, and victimization. And it led to a very unfortunate series of events. The first was that I miscarried. And then, as a result of the legal case that lasted over 3 years, I then developed, severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. I had 2 life-threatening but successful pregnancies. And I watched and endured the breakdown of my marriage, which was absolutely tragic. And I had inherited a legacy of slavery, and I was born into apartheid. And I could have left that legacy as it was, but I decided that I was going to change things. I was going to change my legacy and provide a different legacy for my daughters. And that's how the writing of Kindness, Kale, and Kettlebells came about. And then a few years later, after the case, I opened up and I founded Imbue, my company. And I went to my friends, and they all have varying degrees of very senior leadership experience. And I asked them for advice, and they all agreed on one thing. They told me that I should change my surname because it wasn't doing me any favors. Every time you entered the name Sudhana Singh into a search engine, the most dreadful vilification and photos popped up. And I looked at that and I said to myself, I'm going to keep that name, but I'm going to brand in a completely different way. And Kindness, Kale, and Kettlebells resulted in lead generation, C-suite clients wanting to work with me. My story had transformed my life completely. And it was suddenly a story that was considered by my clients and my readers to be very authentic and one that imbues resilience. And it also brought about social justice.
Yeah, it's certainly an impactful book, and it obviously shot to number one. And did do well with obviously in the book reading author sort of circles as well. What do you think really stuck out in terms of what really led people to be attracted? But why do you think it went to number one and was so successful?
I think, as leaders, we always want to rightfully protect our image. We don't want to look weak, or we don't want to look vulnerable, because we're always trying to protect our image, because we're building a brand and it's difficult to build a brand. But the feedback that I got is that I exposed my vulnerability. And I feel that I exposed a great deal of my humiliation. And I think that was the turning point for me to be regarded as a coach, an executive coach, who really had gone through her journey, and that gave it that authenticity that people look for. Because so often we use corporate language, we cling on to empty jargon that doesn't mean anything. But I was told that this book was the real thing. And when they were dealing with me, I was the real thing, which I think for a leader is crucial today. No matter what we go through, our people, our listeners, our followers are out there rooting for us. They want to travel with us on this journey. They want to come with us. They watch our lows, and as we progress and move away from our lows, they really want to come up with us. So they're there rooting for us.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, what I'd like to actually do is just really read the intro to yourself, really, to introduce yourself, because obviously we came straight in and I wanted to know about your book, but just want people to know actually who Sudhana Singh is. She's an international award-winning author. Her name is Sudhana Singh, former business school lecturer, head teacher, and coaches C-suite executives. Her latest best-selling book is Boss Branding: 7 Ways to Craft a Legendary Brand Story. And it enables you to extract the story residing deep within you as a micro niche to rewrite your narrative to become legendary. So that leads us nicely on to obviously the book itself, which is obviously what really brings us here today. It's I guess here's the book, of course, wonderful as it is. It's lovely. And what led you to write Boss Branding?
Yes, there were actually 3 events that led to the writing of Boss Branding. The first was, I talked about the vilification whenever you put my name into a search engine. And then things dramatically changed after writing the first book. And one day, a colleague of mine rang me and she said, Sudhana, I have a budget. And she named a very large figure. And she said, I want to know who's doing your marketing, because I'm going to have them write my brand story that's similar to yours, the way it was written. And I told her, you don't need to spend such a huge amount of money on your marketing. You save that for something else. But what you can do is you can start by writing your story. Because when people listen to your story, as I said, with all its humiliation, with all its failure, then they are really invested in your journey and in you, and they want to work with you. And that was the first. And the second time was after publishing Kindness, Kale, and Kettlebells, I started talking about it. I was invited to speak about it. So it became my keynote. And once I was on a London stage, and I think you were there as well,
I
Luke.
was. It was very powerful.
Yes. And then, thank you. And then I got off stage and I went to take my seat again. And the man who was next to me, he whispered to me, and he said, I don't have a story to share. I've never been through anything that you have been through, and I'm certain that I have nothing to say. And for me, that was an indicator. I've heard that so many times. And it was an indicator that this is the time that I should write this book to help people see that they have a story within them. And one of the aims of the book is to extract that story that is residing deep within you. And the third indication, and you were there again, Luke, was, I was very privileged to be the judge at the Awards International UK Business Awards, and for your category, which was the Entrepreneur of the Year.
I think I was there as well, wasn't I?
Yes, you were, very much so, a starring role as well. So I was seated there with the judges, and I was looking at, the presentations of all the finalists of your colleagues who stood there before us. And I was really in a quandary. And I said to myself, how on earth am I going to choose the bronze, the silver, and especially the gold, the much coveted gold? And really, at some point, I just said, I can't see the difference. But there's one thing that made a huge difference. It was your story that was so compelling. And
Yep.
that swayed me. And then I said, definitely, I'm writing a book for my people about how they can write their brand story, especially if they feel they don't have one.
That's amazing. Yeah, people's stories are so important, aren't they? And how so many people have stories, but they just don't extract them.
No,
I find personally with the story that a story doesn't just open up doors; it can open up hearts and minds.
absolutely,
And that's
yes.
what I do. Yeah,
Mhm.
to inspire people to obviously go for greatness and to encourage other people to create their stories, and obviously to narrate them in a way that does it justice. But stories definitely impact people, don't they? In a great way. And
They certainly do, yes.
yeah. So sure. So as we consider more about the boss branding, I'm just intrigued. Why did you call it boss branding?
Well, to boss something, as we know, is to do it really well.
Mm,
And when you are boss branding, you are not branding with empty words. You are branding with your very own story that's
mm,
very authentic, that's very true to you. And the people that I have featured in the book are true boss branders. They
mm,
have very compelling stories. There is Graham Hughes, who's in the Guinness Book, the World Guinness record holder, and
yeah.
then there's Donald Brown, who's an award-winning artist, sculptor, and a triple gold medalist for the Masters. And then there's Arya Taware, who's an absolute amazing fintech entrepreneur. And
Mm,
we have Madeleine Kay, who is an activist, a writer, an artist. And of course, we have Alex Babatunde, who won the bodybuilding championships in 2014. And we have yourself, Luke, the UK Entrepreneur of the
mm.
Year. And we'll come a little bit to your story later in the podcast, if I may.
Absolutely, of course. So, in terms of so that's what led you to write it. And why do we need to rewrite our narrative in life and business?
Yes, that's a question I'm often asked because it's a mission for Imbue Coaching and Publishing. We are born with certain legacies. I was born with the legacy of slavery. I inherited apartheid. I came to the United Kingdom, and I unfortunately had to sue for racism. But when we rewrite our narrative, we are actually changing our legacies. And
Mm,
I would like, if I may, to read an extract of a story from Boss Branding, and it's a very
sure.
personal story. It's about my granddad. So, if I may, my story began in 1877. My granddad was the eldest of 5 sons. His parents were slaves. He was more fortunate. His generation broke free of slavery, And at 16, he secured his first job as a waiter at a hotel. He woke up at 5 every day, dressed, and then, as the pipe often froze, he washed in icy water that trickled out reluctantly from the tap. He shivered beneath his threadbare coat and tucked his curls beneath his cap. His mum handed him freshly made bread and a mug of hot sweetened tea. He cycled to the hotel in the pitch dark, his only guide the gleaming frost. Granddad dreamt of owning a little car one day, so his neatly pressed trouser hems didn't get wet in the spiky cold grass. His meager wage made a huge impact on the family budget. Granddad went on to become a serial entrepreneur. He had 5 very different thriving companies. Public transport was one of them, and he ended up owning 5 buses. He also had a live-in chauffeur. In his spare time, he pursued his first love, sport, and he eventually owned and managed a local football team. And you can see in a few short years from that story, in a few short years, what Granddad had achieved. He really rewrote his narrative in a very strident way. He did it quietly, but it was in a very definitive way, I should say. And also in the book I've mentioned, I featured your story. And when I listened to your story and when I wrote your story, I looked at a person who was suddenly given the devastating news that he had Parkinson's. And you chose to rewrite your narrative. The trajectory could have spiraled downwards. Instead, you got over that humiliation because you found it humiliating. Suddenly, you had to rely on someone, you had to work at a slower pace, you had to do things differently. And you also found it humiliating because you had been working from the time that you were 11.
Yeah.
So you changed your narrative. And if I may, I'm going to ask you to help me to read a bit of your story. So if we go to page 92, please, Luke.
Sure. I think, yeah, lovely. Okay, so page 92.
Yeah. So your chapter is entitled The Hero's Journey, and I'm going to read a bit, and I'd like you to help me.
Okay.
It was a crisp winter's morning, the type that Luke Murfitt believed was full of possibilities. But then he thought that every day was a day for winning. He sat opposite a woman whose daily job was difficult and sometimes heartbreaking. She looked at the young man in front of her. He sat upright, his immaculately pressed white shirt and grey suit, together with his ready smile, took her by surprise. To say that he wasn't the usual type that walked through her door would be a very British understatement. She couldn't hold back her surprise. And she said, "You don't seem like the type of person who should be here."
And I said, "I don't actually want to stay here."
And she said, "What do you want to do?"
So I replied, "I want to start a business and help the people who are walking through these doors."
And the lady said, "Well, that sounds great. You can go to the 3rd floor where there is someone who works with entrepreneurs. But before you do, I'm curious, what business do you want to start?" Luke stood up with difficulty and shuffled over to the window. They were at a job centre overlooking Canary Wharf, the very heart of London's business district. He pointed with a trembling hand.
And I said, "You see those skyscrapers 2 blocks away? Those owners are going to be my clients."
How potent is that?
Mhm.
And people, your followers, know your story. And that's what transformed it, how you rewrote your narrative.
Amazing. Well, I think that's a great introduction to people getting boss branding, I think, by and seeing these wonderful stories, and the way that you write is obviously very special. It's quite unique. And it's no wonder that obviously you won an international award for as an author. And it's a wonderful book. I think also, I'd like to ask you, you've obviously overcome many things and you've gone through many things. Another question for you would be, what would you tell your younger self if you could go back and advise that person now?
Do you know, I find that an incredibly interesting question. And I would tell my younger self that failure is the new success. And this is the reason why. When you fail, you have to go through many, many steps. You have to show up,
Mm.
you have to be in the moment. You have to form a vision for your company, yourself, for how your life is going to go, what you're going to go through in life. You have to build a prototype. You have to get on board a top team around you. And then you have to stress test your prototype. And then you have to fail. Because when you fail, you then give yourself space to behave in a more entrepreneurial fashion in both your life and your business. And after failing, you then find a new way of doing it, and you have mastered life and business.
Well, you're the boss when it comes to that. That advice, that's wonderful. Yeah, so that's really lovely. It's a wonderful. I think this opportunity in this interview, as brief as it is a great opportunity to really cause us all to do what I think many people are doing these days, which is reflecting on who they are, what's important to them, who's important to them, and what they're really striving for. And what a great opportunity 2020 for people to actually, to rewrite their narrative, as it says. You've obviously covered seven people who rewrote theirs, and the truth is, everyone has the opportunity to, don't they?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's as you wrote, it enables you to extract the story residing deep within you as you micro niche to rewrite your narrative. Beautiful. Well, thank you for obviously coming to Global Futurists and speaking to our listeners, and I'm sure that people will be wanting to share this and obviously looking up your book on Amazon. Have you got any final sort of advice to people?
Yes, we are, as we all know, we are going through extremely difficult times. And I think COVID has brought many lessons home. We have begun to realize what's really important. But the crucial lesson is we have to do what is right for ourselves and the people who rely on us, and exercise compassion. And I feel there's no better way of doing that by sharing your story, because then your people will see what you've been through and they will have empathy for you. But it also shows that you haven't just gotten there. Nothing good happens in what, overnight, in 30 days, in a month. People who promise you that. Good things happen when you carry on trying and failing, because then your success is ensured. So I would say my final thing is, write your brand story.
Right.
And dare to live like a legend.
Yeah, I try every day.
I think you're doing it right.
Yeah. Well, obviously, a huge thank you to Sudhana Singh. Thank you for bringing this book, obviously, to the bookshelves so that we can actually really look at these deep and considerate questions and find answers within ourselves. And it's amazing. So thank you, Sudhana.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you everyone else who's obviously joined us today, and for coming to listen to us, to talk about boss branding, to talk about ultimately our story and creating that story. And I really hope that we can all think about the things that are considered here, and I highly recommend the book Boss Branding. I have two. So thank you for that, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. And Thank you. Have a great week in all that you do. Take care. Thank you, Sudhana.
Thank you. Bye then.
Bye-bye.
Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. You're looking great.
We are on a mission to reach the world and inspire millions. We invite you to join us in 3 simple ways. Like the show and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Leave 5 stars on the Apple Podcast. Share this on social media. We look forward to you joining us next week. Welcome to Global Futurists.